man, welcome to the intro. No need for introductions. All about the world and the world what we discussing. Where every single thought that we had came from something. So it's funny that we made it when we started here with nothing. Gotta open up your mind just to find out why. When you lost inside the dark, just gotta turn on the light. And no matter what you do, you never run from a fight. Because we fighting to be better and that's why we strive.
This episode is not sponsored by Celsius, but hit us up. So I'm here with Ankith, the co-founder and CEO of Macro. I believe we are Twitter friends. How do we meet? I don't even know.
Yeah, I think it was Twitter.
Twitter. Yeah, shout out to Twitter. If you're in tech, join Twitter. Man, if you want to quickly introduce yourself, we can get started.
Yeah. So hey everyone, my name is Ankith Harathi. I was the co-founder and CEO of Macro. Macro was a Zoom client meant for creatives, really to help you bring your full self. More of your identity and expression over Zoom. Prior to that, I was head of growth at a company called Gamer Sensei. So if you're into esports or competitive video games, huge passion and area of interest of mine.
There you go, man. Very cool. Were you like a passionate like Zoom user, or like what was like the? It's funny 'cause, like, especially like with me and my company, it's like now I'm like so deep into the personal training world, and it's like. I love fitness, but it was like I was never really like obsessed to be a trainer. So I imagine that when you started this, all of a sudden years later, you're like, oh crap, now I'm like obsessed with Zoom. Like, what was your feelings towards Zoom when you first started? I guess.
Yeah, I would be shocked if like someone was just naturally obsessed with Zoom pre-pandemic without being forced to.
Yeah.
So no, definitely was not obsessed with Zoom. I think there's obviously a couple ways to start startups, and you hear a lot of us like become obsessed with the problem and then you become an expert and go do it. But this was very much not that case.
Yeah.
It was, we stumbled onto this idea, and then through the process of like building in the space for so long, you become, naturally obsessed with the problem and the solution that you're building. But no, I mean, we actually started the company, and it was actually formerly called Marlowe in early 2018. And then we pivoted actually to building on top of Zoom in early to mid 2019. And then before the pandemic, we had just raised our seed round to kind of go all in on this Zoom angle.
Great timing, man. Yeah, I look back at, this is one of my questions I was going to ask you about, like whether, the pandemic was kind of like what pushed you to make this. But so obviously you made it before the pandemic. Dude, I can go back to like April and May of 2020 and just how gross I felt, like feeling crammed in my little, room, like doing Zoom drinking games with my buddies. Like, just what a weird, like using the party app we used for a bit, like such a weird time. I mean, I use Zoom all the time still, but like just being forced to have to not be able to see people was tough. And obviously your guys' company that made that a better experience. So what exactly did Macro do? Like, what was why were you guys, we'll get to the acquisition in a sec, but like what made you guys like a fun, cool product for people?
Yeah, so I think that it really came down to two things. One was the ability to like just customize your Zoom experience. So the same, like you were it sounded like physically cramped and physically kind of constrained in your environment wherever you were taking these video calls. And that comes across over video, and on video your video is cropped into this little rectangle, and it's just not a natural way to interact with one another, right? Like I'm sure if you've done video podcasts versus in-person podcasts, like they're very different.
There's a reason we built the studio.
Yeah, exactly.
I've had some dope people that have said that they would be down to do a podcast with me, but then I'm like, they're not in Austin. I'm just like, I can't do it, dude, because my old podcast we did like 100 episodes over like Zoom, honestly.
Yep.
And it was just the experience wasn't even close to the same as like the experience we can get here in person. So, but anyways, continue what you're doing.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think that's exactly the train of thought, right? Is like there's something that's lacking when you're on Zoom, like. Whether it's like micro expressions or like just actually having a third dimension to see someone.
For sure.
And we were trying to bring that back. And I mean, we started pre-pandemic not realizing, everyone is actually going to be forced into this world, and a lot of people are going to struggle. There are some people who are just like maybe just more video native, right? They're really comfortable on video. They've been doing it for their entire careers or just with friends. And for those people, it comes naturally and more easier to express themselves and have that sort of personality. But I think like we all have our own personalities over different mediums. Like I'm a different texter than I am a caller, than I am like a talker, than I am like a podcast person, right? Yeah. I think the medium actually has like a lens or a perspective on our personality, and that's why like I think our personalities are multifaceted. I think when we transitioned to Zoom, people had to figure out like what is my Zoom personality, right? Yeah. Like how do I translate like something that just came so naturally to me, which was just talking to someone in a room, to this new kind of form, and it becomes even more of a problem when it's like, that's the only way I see people, that's the only way I communicate, that's the only way I get work done. And so I think that we stumbled onto this problem, and we actually did approach it from a productivity angle at the beginning, right? Like, we thought, can we make meetings better through like more productivity, right? That could have been integrations or nodes, but really through the pandemic, it helped us learn, like, no, that's not gonna, like, making a meeting more productive with transcriptions and notes and blah blah blah. Like, yes, you have a more productive meeting, but you feel just as drained after it.
For sure.
Like, how do you get this feeling of like, I could have an hour-long conversation with you in person and actually leave feeling energized, but I have almost never, if very rarely, left a Zoom call feeling like more energized than I started it with.
I actually love how you talk about the layers, like the texting versus in person versus like the Zoom situation. Like, I've literally broken up with someone because, like, in person they were great, and then over text, which is like, you know, if you're not living with someone, it's 90% of your relationship is just a text message. They'd just be like, same, yes, okay, and I was like, I can't date this person. I like to put emojis behind them, like, just so you know that, like, I'm putting the time and caring into this message.
Yeah.
And then you do have that other layer. You have the Zoom layer where it's like, your body language is different. You're sitting down. You can't really, like, you know, express yourself. Maybe like you're very, like, I don't know, like, use your hands a lot, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. So
got some Italian.
Yeah, a little bit of this, you know. So that's an interesting take, man. I never even thought about those different like layers, but it's super important to me. So
yeah, I think it comes also down to, like, the tools you use to communicate are also expressions of who you are, right? Like, if you're like, you know, blue versus green bubbles, and like that's like how bottom exactly, like if you're green bubbles, I'm not texting you type of thing, right? I'm just, my dad has an Android and will refuse to convert, but like if you're on Snapchat versus you do Instagram DMs, or I don't know, like basically the apps you use are an expression of who you are, because that's like every app kind of enables some level of like your personality to shine through.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people, I think, gravitate towards the ones that like they feel most comfortable and natural on, or they're able to develop a new identity, right? I think a lot of what is nice about digital is that it lets people create the persona that they want for themselves.
Absolutely.
And that can be anonymous, or that could be pseudonymous, or that could just be like really just who they are. Zoom didn't give anyone that choice, right? It was like a corporate decision. We are now using this, and now this has become our most intimate form of communication for months, years, or maybe now even permanently. So I think macro existed because, very similar to like the Apple 1984 like rebellious commercial, like you're using the software because you've been told to do so.
Yeah.
Like, actually, let's make it a personal choice here. Let's make it now. This software, which is like video, super intimate. Like, how many people are really comfortable being on camera for hours and hours a day? Like, I would say very few.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very intimate form of communication. Like, let's make it a personal choice. You're choosing to do this, and like, let's let you set it up in a way that you feel most comfortable, and like lets your personality shine.
I love that, and we'll get to like how much you guys raised and how like the exit and all that kind of stuff. But
yeah.
What did you do to start? Like, were you doing a bunch of customer testimonials, or interviews, just saying like, hey, like, do you hate video calls? Like, we're gonna fix it. Like, what was that initial process?
Yeah, so actually, we started a company, like I said, called Marlowe, or the product was called Marlowe, and it was a Slack bot that just rated your meetings. And how we got onto that was John and I, my co-founder John, we were obsessed with the idea of like, how do we spend our time? And we were in business school at the time, like when we started this.
Harvard Business School. Like the online one, or like legit? Like,
no, we were in Boston. It was actually a joint degree program called the MSMBA. Cool. So we were doing like getting some technical knowledge along the MBA, and it was really kind of meant for people who wanted to start companies. Very cool. So it was like exactly kind of what we came in trying to do. But you know, when you're in school and when you're working and all this sort of stuff, your time is pulled in like a million different directions, and you never know, like, is that really a good use of my time?
You don't have that Hermione time.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if that existed, we wouldn't have any of these problems, right? It was like, waste of time. Cool. Let me just rewind.
Exactly.
But we were like, okay, we're spending so much of our time in like activities that we end up like regretting or wasting. So let's just rate our meetings, we actually started rating classes at business school, and we'd send it through the section Slack, and people would just rate anonymously what they thought of the classes. Got some traction, and the whole kind of goal was like, where do people spend their time at work in meetings? Let's just rate them anonymously. And we got probably like 30,000 people just like organically using Marlowe over Slack in like 3 months.
Was it a plugin, or
it was a Slack bot, right? Cool. So one person would add it to their Slack. Cory sets it up, and then if I'm in a meeting with you, and we had some filters like, okay, only meetings that were more than 5 people, and at the end of that meeting it'd be like, hey Ankith, Cory's using Marlowe to measure his meetings. what do you think? Here's an anonymous poll, and basically just like emojis of like really angry face to like neutral face to like smiling face. What do you think of this meeting?
Very cool.
And then we, based on what you answer, we had like some pre-bucketed options you could select from, like why was that meeting not great? And it ranged from like didn't need to be a meeting, not enough preparation, unclear agenda, no clear next steps, or like somebody dominated the conversation.
Gotcha.
And that last one was actually by far and away the most often selected reason that the meeting sucked because somebody just took up all the airtime in it.
Gotcha.
And that's actually the initial genesis of Macro, which was we were like, okay, we can either try to solve this by like giving you a report after your meeting saying,
Like, shut the fuck up.
yeah, exactly. Like, hey, Ankith, you spoke 85% of that meeting. Like,
Yeah.
shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
Or we could try to solve it in real time. And the idea was like, well, what if we had like Pokemon style health bars on top of every single person in the meeting? And as you were droning on, you would effectively be killing the other people.
Well, that would stress me out. Dude.
Sure, yeah.
Stress me out. Where I'm like, okay, sorry, keep going. But yeah.
No, yeah, but
Yeah.
that's like, that was kind of the point. Like, in the moment, could you correct that behavior?
Yeah.
And we figured, okay, the only way to do that was we'd have to build our own video conferencing app and get people to switch away from Zooms and Google Meets, or we build on top of their infrastructure and create this like layered experience on top.
Yeah.
And that put us down a rabbit hole of actually building the first third-party Zoom client and then actually enabling a lot more customization and expression features.
That's what I was going to ask you is like, how do you go about building a third-party Zoom client, and then B, like, I guess there's 3 questions. B, did they just let you, or did you just be like, we're going to do it and you can't stop us? And then C, why hadn't there been other ones at that point? A lot of questions.
Yeah, a lot of questions. Okay, so how do you go about building a third-party Zoom client? That's a good question. So when we started, the Zoom developer ecosystem was in its infancy. I think they had just launched their macOS native SDK, they had their OAuth SDK.
Kind of like a Chrome store, essentially, kind of situation where you can like build Chrome apps for Chrome situation.
Kind of. I think it was like they were just starting to open up like how the Zoom app actually worked, but like in very segmented or maybe even fragmented pieces.
Yeah.
Our engineering team was able to somehow, like I think to this day, it was still kind of like a mini miracle, like string together 3 different parts of their developer ecosystem to create a third-party Zoom client. And by that I mean, we basically created a standalone app that you download, and it's called Macro, and you could use that. You click on any Zoom link, it would open through Macro, and you never have to leave Macro. You're in that meeting, and everyone else on that meeting can still be on Zoom, and they see you and you see them, and it just works.
Crazy. Do they see you from like what? Do they see like your macro features, or do you only see those? Like, how does that work?
So it's a little bit split, right? So like the UI itself of Macro, only you get to see because we can't control what anyone else's UI on Zoom looks
For
like.
sure. Yeah.
But your video feed of like how you look in Macro, and like we had a bunch of shapes and filters and that sort of stuff, that came through to other people on Zoom, so they'd see you and your stuff. But the second question, like, how did Zoom kind of feel about this? They actually reached out to us and saying like, how did you do that? Like, they're like, how did you figure out how to do this? Because they hadn't even, I don't know if they had not realized it was possible, but they definitely had not enabled that as like a core use case.
For sure.
And we actually helped them like saying like, hey, here's exactly what we did. I mean, we could have been coy about it, but I think that would have led to them like they could easily have shut us down.
Oh, for sure.
So we were just like, here's exactly how we did it. This is what would have made it a lot easier to do, and like we want there to be more of these type of apps that come about.
Very cool. No, it's funny. Like as a app developer myself, like we've had features that I didn't even know were live yet, and someone's emailed me like, "Hey, like, what do I do with this button?" And I was like, "Dude, I didn't even know that feature was out. Like, how did you do this?"
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, you tell me what we should do with that button. Yeah, that's hilarious, man. Wait, and then what was my last question? Why wasn't there other ones? It was just so early in that phase, I guess.
Yeah, it was early, and now there have been a couple that have actually gotten pretty big. I think class.com is like one of the biggest, and it's like for the teaching use case.
Oh, gotcha.
But I think like in general, I think it's pretty hard to do. And I'm not saying that like, it's like rocket science, but it is like a trade-off of, are you really trying to customize Zoom? Because if you do that, if you're really trying to customize the whole UI of Zoom, you don't get anything for free, right? You have to kind of rebuild a lot. You have to rebuild chat, breakout rooms, reactions, all this sort of stuff, because now the bar for what's like table stakes in a video conferencing app
100%.
is so high.
100%.
Like people want raise hand and breakout rooms and like sharing only portions of your screen and not your whole screen or not just an app, right? Like the bar is so high that you have to rebuild a lot of this functionality for people to even want to start using your app before they even get to your core value proposition.
100%.
So most people are like, no, we do want to customize Zoom, but actually 99% of the Zoom UI is fine. We kind of want to add something to the side. And you could do that without customizing Zoom, and Zoom released what they're calling their Zoom apps that effectively put an iframe on the side of their Zoom panel window.
Gotcha.
So they're now more recent solutions that don't require doing all of that. But our value is like, we actually want to change Zoom itself, right? It's not just a side thing to Zoom, it's the whole thing.
And I think you put a good point there that I tell every single founder that I talk to is that, like, for example, our old app was a B2C and we had a social media component. And then for years I was trying to push it and push it and push it. And then one day I was like, why would I ever use this versus Instagram or Twitter? Like, why would I ever post in the WeStrive social feed when all my friends are in other apps?
Yeah.
And like with that Zoom situation, it's like, dude, you can't just rebuild Zoom because you're going to get every complaint in the world. Like, I can't raise my hand. I can't do this. I can't do that. So like, it really does become a standard when you're trying to like replicate a current competitor. And even in our space, like, there are so many times we'll add a feature as an all-in-one tool and I'll see people complain instantly because they're like, oh, why can't this feature do this because this competitor does that? And you're just kind of like, dude, come on, like, just be happy that I have the feature. But people really expect the bare minimum at this point, which is Zoom.
Yeah.
So how'd you guys go about like raising $5 million? Congrats. There we go.
Thank you.
It
It was a little bit. It was like 4.8, but yeah, a little bit less than 5.
Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, very, very cool. I mean, at that point, that is $200,000, but that's at that point it's 4.5. Yeah, pretty close.
Yeah.
So we got First Mark, General Catalyst, and then some other VCs and angels. So like, when you're going into those pitches, what are you saying? Like, we're going to change Zoom. Like, this is going to be, no one's going to use Zoom anymore. They're going to use us. Like, why are they giving you guys $4.8 million?
Yeah. So the $4.8 million was raised over 2 rounds. So the first $500K was actually like a pre-seed round led by Underscore. Next to you, we were in Boston at school. They were kind of core Boston VCs.
Cool.
Believed in us very, very early. And that was like, we had just started to build Marlo, the Slack bot, and started to use it within our classes. Cool. So that was like, let's start to scale, hire full-time engineers, even when we were students, but we were very not good students. We were basically running this company full-time, and then launch into companies and get those meetings. The 4.3 million seed round led by General Catalyst and First Mark, and also Underscore and the angel investors too. That was the story. There was, we've built Marlo. It has 30,000 users across a couple hundred small and huge companies. Yeah. We've seen all this data, and the data is telling us like, the meeting UI needs to change to stop things like someone dominating the conversation. And we basically pitched them on this vision of like, we've built something, we know how to build things, we know how to get them to like some decent scale already. Yeah. Like, we have a ton of data that's like pretty uniquely ours. No one else kind of has this data of like exactly why these certain meetings suck, and we're going to use that to build this. Cool. And it was kind of like we've done this, give us money to do this thing. And this thing, we didn't even have the name Macro. We were calling it Super Chat at that point. Nice. But we still had the vision. We had the mock-ups of like this Zoom UI like augmentation layer and like how it would solve all the core pain points that were coming up from our unique data set. And that was a pitch of like, we've done this, we're like a tested team. We spent of that 500K, I think we probably spent 300K. We spent that effectively. Here's what we've done with it. Here's what we've de-risked from the business. Here's what we've developed in terms of our vision. Now we need a lot more money to go and do this other thing. Yeah. And that's a little bit of a tough pitch. Like, a lot of companies will be like, we've done this, it's working, we want it to work even more, give us money to like pour fuel on the fire, right? For sure. And maybe that happens more from like seed to Series A. But for us, the story was, no, actually, like, we've done this one thing, give us money to do this kind of separate thing, but using the insights that we got from the first. That
is interesting too, because you're like saying, hey, we're crushing this on Slack, now we're going to raise a bunch of money and then crush this on Zoom, and we're going to get rid of the Slack thing in general. That's a really big jump to convince investors to put that much money in. Yeah. When you're basically like a awesome add-on tool for 2 completely different tech giants. Yeah. So I mean, props to you for raising the money. I don't know.
I mean, the platformers question just comes up every single time, right? Yeah. And like, there is no like silver bullet answer to that question. Platform risk is 100% real. Yeah. It's partially some of the reasons that we ended up selling, but you can't, like, when you tie your entire business to somebody else's platform, their decision making, their pace, their security concerns, all will affect like the core fundamentals of your business without you having any sort of control.
It's terrible, dude. I don't lose sleep a lot. I mean, actually, I do, just because I can't shut my brain off. But like, the times where I've been up till 7 a.m. sweating in my bed is when Apple will randomly send us an email, and I literally have PTSD because I launched my first company, and they pulled it off the App Store during our launch party, and I had no control. And so we had to shut down the company, all this stuff. So like, I get an email from Apple, and it will say like, oh, there's an error in your upload, and I'll literally start instant sweat, because you can't control it.
Yeah.
If Zoom one day was like, hey man, actually like we don't like this, gone.
Yeah, we're
Nobody's
fucked. Yeah, this is like, we just return the money and be like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Or we figure something else out, right? Yeah.
That's why I get your situation to exit. You're like, I mean, we probably could keep growing this, but like, dude, if we're gonna take it when we can, because like you never know what they're gonna do.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, like to Zoom's credit, they were, for how big that company is and like all the changes that they had to go through in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Like, they did a fantastic job at like scaling their own product, right?
Oh, for sure.
And
yeah.
I think that like their ecosystem, their developer ecosystem, was very much like a secondary concern, but it started to become, and it's I think continuing to become like more of a primary concern. And they did everything they could to support us. Like, I think that they were super encouraging of like listening to our feedback, trying to get like our core problems solved for other people, because we were kind of like, if you look at Nitin, one of our first engineers at Macro, he like basically like wrote all the big questions and the big threads on like those Zoom developer forums. Like, he was hitting all these issues of like, hey, the SDK actually doesn't work here, here's like a workaround, like before even the Zoom devs found it, right? So he was asking like the tough questions, and essentially like we were paving the road for all the people to hopefully come after us, so they wouldn't have to hit these issues. But yeah, man, I think that like kind of transitioning to, hey, why sell? It was, a lot of the reason was the platform risk, and not that they would shut us down. They loved us. I think to this day they actually offered to invest in our next Series A, like if we were going to raise that round.
Very cool.
But really, there were changes that they were making on the security standpoint, which I get why they were making them, but it would kind of hinder our bottoms-up growth model, and the pace that they were developing and adding features to the SDK that we every single day more urgently needed was too slow for us to feel conviction, and like, yes, continuing to build 100% of our business on them was the right decision.
For sure. Did you think at any point, like, because obviously you were acquired by a different company, but did you think that like Zoom at any point was going to be acquiring you guys, or is that never really on the table?
I mean, so when you choose to build your company on top of another company, you immediately limit the amount of exit options.
They have hella leverage.
Yeah, they do, right? Like, because like you unless you like just go for pure acqui-hire, right? Like, talented team can go pretty much anywhere. You have a lot of options. But if you're like, no, I want my tech to be worth something, or I want someone to acquire us from some, like, attribute some value to the thing we've built for the last like number of years, then like your subset of companies who would actually be interested are super small. For sure. Right? And for us, it was like literally probably a handful of companies, like less than a handful of companies.
Were you going out there reaching out for an exit, or like it just kind of got an email one day kind of a thing?
So it wasn't necessarily like an email one day, but like throughout the journey of building Macro, we had a couple of like people reach out, and a lot of those conversations we would just kind of brush off, ended early. There are a couple that like when they reached out, or we just had like kind of a mutual connection, we were talking for another reason, like we explored it loosely, but then it was like they were either doing stuff in the video space that was like kind of very different than synchronous, or stuff that was like more social or less social, and we were in this interesting spot of like, we are team and company oriented, but like more personally, kind of more consumery feeling in that enterprisey space. So it was either kind of like a not worth a discussion, or not really a fit, like we would not want to work at this company. And then with the company that bought us, so Phil Libin's company that came out of his Ultra studio, that was more of like, actually we share a common investor in General Catalyst. And they had raised a ton of money, like at the time where we were like just kind of preparing for our launch. They announced their 100 million Series B from
I saw that,
from SoftBank and Sequoia, and then in that article, actually I remember reading this article where they talk about all the stuff that they've been doing with the camera, which is effectively like, for people who don't know it, it's like OBS, but for the general consumer. It gives you superpower, so you can do a ton of crazy stuff on video without being like a podcast host who knows how to do all the stuff, right? Like in that article, the reporter asks Phil like, hey, what are you going to do with all this funding? And the obvious answer is like, grow, scale, hire more teams. But he also talked about specifically Zoom, and saying like they had built this great camera input into Zoom, and they were thinking about like building like, you know, full end-to-end like application. For sure. And so I'm like, okay, these people might just start to become our competitors. Like maybe they launch their own thing. And I had actually talked to Phil maybe at that point a couple months prior, and Quentin Clark, actually our investor in General Catalyst, who also was that general catalyst when Phil was there, kind of reconnected us. We got to talking, and I was just curious, asking Phil, like, hey, like, I saw this little line in your article for your funding announcement, like, how are you thinking about that? And he basically said to me, like, no, they just raised the money. They didn't have the team to, like, their team was core focused on, like, their camera application. For sure. Aggressively hiring. They didn't have any of the tech built or like maybe the team expertise to go in and build a Zoom application. Mm-hmm. They were thinking about doing it. And that conversation kind of slowly turned down to, like, should we do this together? For right? Sure. Like, do we come and, like, bring our tech over and, like, enable this kind of future that they were building towards, and really kind of have a close end on the Zoom ecosystem from both asynchronous communication, asynchronous communication, both standalone and also, like, dependent on Zoom.
Very cool. And how long is that, like, negotiation process? Like, were they kind of just like, we're going to buy you for X amount, and then we're good to go? Or were you guys kind of going back and forth for months? What was that like?
No, there's some back and forth, but I mean, in general, I think that, like the position that we were, this was, keep in mind that this was, like, kind of mid to end of 2021, so, like, market is still, like, really hot right now. Tons of capital. Really hot. Yeah, right. Sure. So, like, there was and then we had, of the 4.3 million that we had raised, almost like a year and a half prior, we had more than 3.5 still in the bank.
They're chilling.
Yeah, so it's like there was no urgency on our end. Like, we were like, okay, even if we were like, okay, we don't feel confident in Zoom anymore, we had money to go and pivot and do other things, right? So it wasn't like a end all be all. Yeah. But the conversation progressed, and they threw out a number, and we actually felt like that was actually quite fair, given, like, we had macro in a closed beta for about a year, and in August or September of 2021, we were going to launch it publicly. And this was August of 2021 that we had even started talking with Phil. We thought the number was fair, and then I think we spent more of the time actually kind of negotiating it. I wouldn't even say is, like, the right way to say it, because I think they approached it very fairly, recognizing the effort that we had put in and the technology we had built, and it was more just, like, timeline of kind of those earnouts and that sort of stuff. And I would say within a couple weeks we're, like, on the same page. And then the couple months was just lawyers and docs and figuring out who's indemnified or who's on the hook for certain things, and talking with our investors, getting everything signed. And that's just, like, a huge pain in the ass, but I'm glad that I think it needs to happen for, like, legal reasons of people don't want to be stuck holding the bag and not knowing what the bag is, type of thing. For sure. So yeah, it took time, but I think after talking with our investors and other people outside of the space, kind of retrospectively, it was a very fast process. Like, for sure. We weren't rushing it per se, but we were also just like, it is kind of, when you go through that process, one, if you haven't told your team yet, you kind of feel this, like, split personality of, like, like, you need to put on the face of, like, no, we're still building towards this stuff, and, like, we're doing all the right things, and we're gearing up for our public launch. When you know this other process is happening, and it's maybe not sure enough that you want to tell your team just yet, and distract them and, like, get their hopes up or whatever that could do emotionally, without, like, taking your eye off the prize. Yeah. But then you also have to play this role of, like, you're splitting your personality, your time, your energy, your efforts.
Yeah, that's tough too, man. It's like, it's kind of like, well, why should we launch this feature if we're gonna be sold in 2 weeks? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, we wasn't even a feature; it was our whole product. I know we actually did. We publicly launched September of 2021, and by that point, we already had like docs being started and stuff, and the acquisition ended up closing in early November of 2021. God,
is that stressful? 2 months, you're like, okay, well, what if we get, like, 10 users and then they pull out of the acquisition, you know?
Yeah, I think that for them, like, to be very, very honest, right, like, when we had started the discussions, like, it was never about how much usage macro got. Yeah. It was really just about, like, the team, like, who it is that, like, is actually coming over and, like, building it with the expertise that we had, and then the technology, like, the fact that they could and their employees, and that they had a bunch of people on their team download and try out the app and see what actually the product did, right? It wasn't like they weren't buying a business. Like, we didn't have a business, right? And what I mean by business is we didn't have, hundreds of thousands of users or paying customers or anything like that. Like, we had a 10,000 person closed beta that we were running, and we're just launching it publicly. And they weren't, doing that to buy those users or buy that as, like, a marketing list. They weren't. And I think that's, like, we're very clear about, like, where's the value lie in here, and it's, like, the tech and the team. And there's no, like business and revenue and other stuff that they're acquiring alongside it. So I think that there wasn't pressure on, like, how well the launch goes. Obviously, the better the launch goes, it's just, like, it would feel good, like, for all the effort we had put in. But it's still stressful because acquisitions can fall off and fall apart in, like, a moment's notice, right? either of our boards could have said something or been like, no, it's not worth investing in this right now, or this is not the right time, or whatever it is. And so, yeah, you're basically like hedging of like getting really excited about what the future may hold either way, right? You have to still be excited about at the end of the day, it's your company and you still need to run it, whether or not you're getting acquired or not. But you also want to feel excitement about the direction that you're leaning towards, which is like an acquisition discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I've had so many people on the podcast that have like had last minute acquisitions just fall through, and then they have to just kind of go, they have to just restart their mindset and go back into the table like, okay, now we have to build this company. So I'm glad that wasn't the situation for you guys. Did you see user growth in those first few, because like you said, you're kind of doing both sides of the coin where you're trying to like grow this new product you just launched, but you're kind of like, we're probably going to get bought within 3 weeks. So were you guys growing? Like, do you have users? Like, what was the situation there?
Yeah, after we launched, like we put a ton of effort and money into our launch still. And I think it was like we had done 2 launches at Macro. One, like just showcasing the product as like going into like opening the beta and then closing it after we hit some cap of like we can only kind of deal with this much feedback.
Yeah, for sure.
And that was an awesome launch. And I think the next launch we did was like it was everything that Macro kind of like we unearthed and defined as its kind of culture and mission in that last year, right? The whole mission of like bring your full self, unleash creativity, your personality, develop your identity on Zoom. Like that was developed in that year of going from closed beta. And I think that the launch and the content that we were able to put out around it was like so truly ours that there was never an option to not launch it, right? Even if the acquisition like was an earlier time frame or whatever, we were going to launch it because like I think that for the amount of effort that the team put in, like it was the world deserved to see it.
For sure.
And yeah, it was awesome. Like I think we stayed up all night, did the whole product hunt launch thing, like saw the people rolling in, the users downloading it, all the feedback pouring in, all the support from the tech community and our existing and early users. And yeah, it was an awesome moment.
So they were. Well, I love that, man. First of all, like I know I've done a few product hunts myself. I know the
product hunt is a game in and of itself.
Oh, for sure, man.
Yeah.
So you guys all got acqui-hired, right? It's like the whole team, or just you two, like 2 founders, or who?
No, so our whole team we had some contractors that unfortunately weren't part of it, but the whole team moved over to.
Very cool. And so what were the terms? Like, how many years did you have to work there? What was your role once you worked there? Like, or you just kind of like moved over and then you're like, okay, I'm full time on Macro, kind of a thing?
No, so it was always with the intention that Macro was not going to be run as a side business unit. I think Phil has his perspective, which I agree with. When companies are brought over and then just kind of left to run in their little silo, like they're not the core focus of the actual larger organization. They may, like, sometimes they are successful and they can kind of be run independently, but we never want it to be this like afterthought or like side quest for the company, right? We want it to be in the day-to-day, and the company wasn't big enough. Like when we joined, I think was like 120 people.
Gotcha.
We wanted to be part of the main discussion, like why we were all there showing up for work every day. And so it was never like Macro's going to be run as its own business unit. It was really actually like we were planning on integrating the tech and like being part of the core team. I know we had our roles defined, and I was like a product lead for the like basically what we were at the time calling the product, and we had the TV product, which was separate. And the team kind of moved over into their respective design or engineering or really actually that was design, engineering, or product were like 3 core functionalities that we had.
Very cool. Wait, how long were you there for?
So there was no like, oh, you must stay, like, I don't know, type of thing. But there was like a 2-year kind of period where it was like, okay, so there's some portion that was paid out immediately when the acquisition closed, and then at a 1 year and a 2 year, and I'm currently at the year and 3 months type of mark, and so like 2 years, like, so I'm still employed by.
I actually did not know that. So
yeah. So then 2 years will be in November.
Very cool. Wait, what? So is it still called Macro? Or what's it called?
So Macro, like a couple months after the acquisition, was sunsetted, as the goal was to transition a lot of the Macro tech into and for various reasons, some of them being the same Zoom security reasons. Like we've held off on releasing that product to the public, and we're actually just early as this year, like continuing to investigate and figure out like what's the fastest and the best way we can bring that product to market. Gotcha. But there's also a lot of other projects that like we, as the core Macro team, and then other people have like started to be pulled onto.
So okay, so you build Macro, you get acquired by and then for the past year and a half, like Macro's kind of been like on pause, well not on pause, but kind of been like hidden until you're comfortable with security, all that kind of stuff, releasing it back to the public essentially.
Yeah, and the goal is not to ever release macro in the same way that it was, right? Like,
yeah, it'll be like a part of the
exactly, like, and like part of that macro technology was like a macro was a Zoom client. Can we bring that like Zoom client technology to
Gotcha.
people could have their meetings within and so they're creating all their asynchronous video and synchronous calls, whether that be in or a Zoom call, all from one app, so that's like everything video. Because that's what the mission of which really appealed to us, which is it's all about communication superpowers, right? And I think that if you think about what we talked about earlier in the podcast around the way you communicate, like every app you use puts a lens on your communication, and we're trying to help people communicate in their best way and either let the best parts of them shine through that they want to shine through, or even help them improve how they communicate, whether that be live speaking, public speaking, on Zoom calls, in recorded video, whatever that medium is. Like video and audio are here to stay as like formats for how people communicate, and we're here to try to help them do that better.
Very cool. I notice I say a lot when I'm talking, and I'm like, I need to stop, because we've said it like 80 times.
Yeah.
And I know I'm gonna have to go back through when we do our shorts and reels and like correct the way they spell automatically from the AI.
Yeah.
It's gonna be so fucking annoying. But anyways.
Well, so that was actually like a interesting thing. Like I always ask Phil like, hey, why is it called and I think publicly like Phil had said like in for some funny reasons, like he wanted a name that people could say when they're eating, right? Because you think about streamers and using kind of some software like OBS, right? Like they're eating food, it's like easy to just say like but really I think the real reason he's later said this, why it's named is it's kind of just like a default agreeable term. For like when you say you're just agreeing with something, you're like nodding when you're saying it, and it's kind of like a yes, and it's a positive reaction, and I think that's exactly kind of the ethos. But it is a tough name to say, and like people are like, wait, what's the name of your company, or like where do you guys work now? So it leads to a lot of questions, which could be a benefit the way you look at it.
Well, and so have you do you work close with Phil then? Because I didn't know who he was, but I googled him, and he had like a big old Google profile and stuff. He looks legit. But have you worked close side by side with him, or like you've been on a couple calls? Like, what's your guys' relationship, I guess? Yeah,
so we work very closely. Like Phil's a very hands-on CEO. I mean, the company's also not big enough for like the CEO to be some kind of nebulous figure who's not really involved in the company. But no, he's involved in the day-to-day, like involved in a lot of like the product decisions, design decisions come from Phil, and like we're always kind of talking back and forth of like what are the priorities here, and I think the priorities shift from like also where is a core focus of development needed, whether it's on like certain parts of the ecosystem of but when it comes to like the app, which is like right now we have like downloadable apps that you can also use with Zoom, or like create your own asynchronous content within.
Gotcha. And
so that's kind of the product area that I take over, and he and Gabe, the design lead, and then Seth, the CTO at like we're all kind of talking in meetings and figuring out like, hey, what's product prioritization? And he has a very loud and active voice in that, because he does have like the experience of creating a company like Evernote that was used by that many millions of people.
Oh, for sure.
So understanding consumer behavior, he does have an act for it, right? And I think that he'll tell you that he has a ton of ideas, and he'll think they're all great, and like a part of it is like our job to figure out like what are the great ones, what are the not so great ones, and make those right decisions.
And have you learned a lot from working with like he was the CEO of Evernote, right? Have you learned a lot from working with someone like that, CEO to CEO?
Yeah, I think that like, I mean, some of the biggest things I've learned is, so I've never really worked in a large company before. Actually, even though it's quite small by general standards, is the largest company I've ever worked for.
There's still 100 plus employees. There's still a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, but you look at, I've never had like the Facebook or like any of the FANG type of experience. But I think you see a lot of different types of leadership styles, a lot of different types of organization, reporting styles, and so it's like it's interesting to learn and see how other companies are run, because when you're running your own company, like it's really hard to even imagine like a completely different world. Hundreds of employees are just a different way to work, and like this company's set up so differently by virtue of like it also being like almost 10x the scale of macro.
For sure.
But yeah, you just learn a lot from like different company environments, both good and bad, and like what we could have done better and what we can do better now. And so there's a lot of learnings.
Is there stuff post exit that you, whether it's working with Phil or just like through this experience being at, is there things that you look back on and you're like, maybe with macro we could have done this and it would have gone better? Like obviously an exit's awesome, but like is there things that you think you could have improved on retrospectively?
Totally. I think there's a lot that we could have done differently, especially in like the go to market and just how we approached like choosing what to build at Macro.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of what we did was like gut feel, right? Like we weren't, doing a ton of data, and I think you do this as an early stage startup. Like you're not doing a like 10x amount of market research and then just like making one decision. You're doing a lot of like what you feel like is intuitive, right?
Yeah.
Putting it out there, seeing how people react, and
yeah.
iteratively working. I think that actually working with Phil has given me even more confidence to be like, no, you're maybe even too early to listen to people, and you just do whatever the fuck you think is right, and you'll very quickly realize if you're right or wrong. I think we spent a lot of the time at Macro debating on what's that line of like when should we listen versus when should we go with what's right, and I think that's a lot of like what I've kind of experienced so far.
Dude, but the best quote I've ever gotten on this podcast, I interviewed John, the founder of Wander, and he discussed, and I totally support what he said. I was like, he discussed reversible versus irreversible decisions. He's like, if you're discussing what like fucking soda you have in your office, just fucking pick an option and you can change it later. But like if you're deciding, or like even like a feature, what color it is, just pick it. You can change it later. But like when you're deciding like irreversible options, like letting an employee go, that's when you should actually take the time to think about shit. But like when it's basic things like features, just put it out there early on and then you can fix it. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I was like, I wrote that one down. I was like, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I think that like basically like anything that you do to make your decision making process slower.
Exactly.
Like there's a trade-off, right? Like at some point it's worth, like you said, taking time, but there's an inflection point where it's like now the extra time is actually decreasing. Like
for sure. We're going back to Marlowe.
Yeah.
There you go.
Exactly.
Was this worth our time?
Exactly. Was it worth our time, right? And so there's always a trade-off. You'll never know exactly what that right spot is.
Yeah.
But in startups, like time, money, which are effectively the same thing in startup world, that is like your executioner. So speed really determines everything. 100%. And the faster you can do, like you can make high quality hypotheses and test them, and you could be right 90% of the you could be wrong 95% of the time. But as long as you're doing enough tests that you get 5 to 10% right, and or you figure out what's right there, that's all that matters.
100%. So what kind of a CEO, like what are you good at as a CEO and what were you bad at as a CEO?
Yeah, so I think that like this is a good question. I think I was, as a CEO, like the biggest thing I think I did poorly at Macro was setting like a long-term vision. Gotcha. Like I think it's asked for a lot from VCs and your pitches and figuring out like what does this company look like in 5 or 10 years. To me, if I rewind myself back to that time, I could not imagine what 5 or 10 years looked like because the world was changing so rapidly. Like you saw during COVID and the pandemic, like how quickly things changed, how many new tools are coming up every day. Like the fundamental ways that we communicate were being rewritten every like month, it felt like.
100%.
It was impossible for me to imagine like what did Macro look like in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And so in some ways I just didn't have that like true North Star of like what are we working towards, like, and that is super helpful in making decisions of like if I had a North Star and it was like along this vector and we had a decision that we were debating and it could have been irreversible or at least like a long-standing decision that maybe you could reverse but it would take a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Like a North Star gives you a framework of like what moves you there faster, better, more effectively.
Exactly.
Right? When you don't have that, and like I think I was great at thinking about like maybe 1 or 2 years out because I could imagine that like future in that level of increment granularity. Yeah. And that was like cool. We have a full roadmap, but thinking like so far out, like what is the vision here that you could say in one kind of pithy, concise sentence?
For sure.
Didn't have that.
So you're thinking more micro than macro, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I was holding that joke in for like 4 minutes. I was like, finish your story.
No, that's it. Did you just cut all my whatever I said out? Just like leave it at that.
Just fast forward it.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. What advice do you have to like entrepreneurs that are starting off? Like, is there things that like, I mean, I've asked you this question like 4 different ways basically, but like, is there things that like, they can do to like kind of accelerate their early growth or like things that you would go back and change easily?
Yeah. I would just say like have conviction in yourself. I mean, I think a big problem that and I think a lot of startup founders deal with is not imposter syndrome as it's kind of typically been described, at least to me. Imposter syndrome is like you feel like you don't belong where you kind of are, like you somehow made it here but you don't really deserve it.
For sure. I
think it's more about like almost a self-confidence thing than imposter syndrome, which is like VC's jobs, especially when you're pitching, is to like question you and like put holes through all your ideas, right?
Basically.
Exactly, right? Like that's effectively what they're doing. They're like, oh, you didn't think about this, or like, what's your answer to this, and is it good enough or not, right? through that, like, yes, your confidence will be shaken. I think that it's like very rare for you to come out of that process not having it like been altered in some way. But then even after fundraising, right, like all these questions exist about like, will this business work? And you'll have days where you're like, this is the next fucking big thing. If we do this, like, we're fucking unstoppable. And you'll have days where like, I don't think this is it. Like, this is, nothing's like working out. Like, there's a gut feeling, like a sinking stomach, like maybe we need to pivot. I think at the end of the day, like, listen to yourself more than anybody else, right? And I think it's really helpful when you have a co-founder to like talk those things through, but really like how you're feeling internally matters more than anybody else, because no one else knows your business. They can like chat shit from the sidelines and like say what this they think this looks like, or look at these competitors and how they're growing or not growing, but like at the end of the day, like if you feel like, oh, this is the right decision, and I just feel that way, and even if people are like, oh, but people tried something similar and it didn't work, or like that's not good enough, or that's not a lofty enough vision, like it doesn't fucking matter.
Exactly.
Like, do whatever you want. Like, have conviction in yourself. You have the money. Like, people bet on you, and like VCs, especially at this early stage, all they're betting on is you. Like, your idea is probably worthless. Your execution is what's going to determine if your idea is worth anything or not. And like, it's okay to not do everything that they think is okay. It's okay to like make mistakes. It's okay to like purposely ignore other advice coming in and do the exact opposite, as long as you feel like that's the right decision. And I wish I listened to like our own internal feelings more, and like stopped letting kind of outside voices come in and like shake my confidence or shake any sort of conviction I had in a direction that we were thinking about.
And one last question here. I'll move this earlier into the podcast, but when you guys had your exit conversations, how did your investors feel about that? Were they like pumped to add another exit to the resume? Were they kind of like, I wanted you guys to wait this out, I want to be here for the long run? Like, what was their, and I know, keeping in mind that one of them was also an investor in the company acquiring you.
Totally. So like, I'm not going to paint this as any sort of like massive acquisition,
like,
right?
It's not like 200 million.
No. Right? Like, this was like a very modest like outcome for us. It was great for the team. I think every team member like financially benefited from this acquisition.
Sure.
I also still maintain that it was like the right business decision given like the risks of platform and all this sort of stuff. From the investor perspective, like the game that VCs are playing are like, they're not trying to, like, baseball analogy, even though I don't know really shit about baseball, they're not going for like singles and doubles, right? They're going for home runs. Like, they're playing the power law. They make all their money when one of their investments returns 100x. That covers all their losses, right? All our VCs were made pretty much whole, and like had some options there of what they could do with their cash. And I think that for them, when they first told them the news of like, hey, we're thinking about taking this, we're kind of in these discussions, I think their natural response is like, you guys don't need to take this. Like, you have money in the bank, you're making solid progress, you're literally just about to launch.
That's tough.
Like, their goal is like, I mean, they either get a finite lower than 100x return that they're shooting for, which is like a known thing if we take this, or we get a couple more swings at bat, which could go to zero, which is probably like going to zero and returning their money are way closer together. They're effectively the same, right?
Exactly.
They're effectively the same to these VCs who like, they invested a couple million in us. These are multi-billion-dollar funds, right? Like, so really like a 1x, a 0x, even a 2 or 3x is probably like the same. Versus like, if they give us like the fifth swing, if we take a fifth swing, right, and it somehow goes to like 100x, that's what they're playing for, right? So like, you know the motivations of each kind of player and person on your cap table, but like when we told them our reasoning of like, hey, listen, like, we've done these things, we've tested these things, the Zoom risks are here, like, and we really think this is the right decision that also sets all of us up to like reach more people in the future, resolve the dependency off of Zoom, and now also integrate from just not only an app side but from the camera side too. Like, we laid out all of our reasoning to them. They're like, okay, this makes sense. We get why you want to take it, and I think at that point they all became super supportive. Very cool. Right? But I think that they need to walk through the same journey that we did and what we were living through every single day, because we were only touching base with them. Some people like maybe once or every other week, but then other people in board meetings, right?
From third party, they're like, what the fuck, what do you mean you're selling? And then you're like, explain the actual, you're like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and they get it. And I also think that like, VCs aren't there to force you to stay in your company, right? Like, I mean, the best ones aren't. Like, maybe some shitty ones are going to force you, like, no, fuck you, you're going to work at this company thing, and I'm not going to let you get acquired.
Exactly.
But like, they realize like, if the team thinks this is the right decision, like, there's no way that same team is going to be motivated to work on the company you force them to stay at.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Oh, I love it, man. Do you have anything you want to leave the viewers with?
Download We Strive if you're like a personal trainer.
Download or what do we
download. I mean, I think that like exists because I think we all could be better versions of ourselves on video. Video's tough. Yeah. Having been on video in the video space for like over 3 or 4 years now, like still struggle with it daily. Yeah. And I think that helps you just feel more comfortable, more natural, and do fun things on video. I use it in like a much more fun and a whimsical way. Other people use it in like more formal presentations. Yeah. But I think it gives you like whatever powers you feel like you want on video and to come off in whatever way you want to come off.
100%, man. Well, you're killing it on all 3 of these cameras, so there we go.
Yeah.
Good stuff, man. Hey, pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you, Cory.
Man, that's why we strive.
Yeah.
There we go. I wanted to thank you for watching this entire episode of Why We Strive. Be sure you head to whywestrive.com and subscribe so every Tuesday you can see incredible interviews with some of the best tech founders, investors, and creatives in the industry. Have an amazing day, and don't forget to keep striving.